right, so I'm going to refilm this because the first time it took a little too long. I'm going to do a few reviews this week. The first one is of The Family from Netflix, and a couple people that I know on Twitter have probably seen some tweets about it concerning what I think is the deceptive nature of this series. And I would say that if you do still have a Netflix account, and you want to cancel it, this might be one of the reasons people are canceling it for religious reasons. Or, well, maybe religious or political reasons, I should say. Now, I think usually it's not really my intention to defend the religious right. However, when you have a series that basically labels them as racist or as warmongers or as coddlers of dictators or as these people who completely lack any principle, but then it contradicts itself over and over again, I think that you do have to consider that, yeah, even though religious right, if you're a person who believes in separation of church and state, you should be able to get the benefit of the doubt on certain things. Now, there were a number of topics that they delved into that were, of course, pretty flawed in The Family. So the first episode was more about the goings on at their lodge. They had I'd say they call it C Street, this lodge in Washington, D.C., where some of their volunteers would typically work for and do chores for members of Congress. That technically counted as an in-kind political donation at the time. And yeah, that got a few politicians in Washington, mostly conservative GOP people, in a bit of hot water. The fact is, however, that you do have these members of Congress today who are far, far, far more rich and have much more access to power and lobbyists. Dianne Feinstein comes to mind. I mean, how is this woman able to afford a personal driver for 20 years when she's the senator for California, and then that driver turns out to be a Chinese spy? So I'm sorry, there's going to be a lot of whataboutism here. But the fact is that a lot of the corruption exposed in this series, and I can't show any footage because I'm dead sure that Netflix would hit me with a copyright strike. However, the first episode, yes, there is a lot of, I would say, indiscretion, in-kind donation that is not monetary, but it's in the form of various tasks that members would perform for members of Congress. Most of them just like errands and things like that. Nothing like ridiculous. And I mean, they didn't suck any congressman's dick so far as I know. Although if that was the case, I guess it would be a more interesting story. There were, however, a number of connections to people like Mark Sanford and John Ensign and probably another person who I've forgotten. I don't remember precisely how many politicians who they were these conservative members of Congress, and then they or in Sanford's case, he was the governor of South Carolina at the time, and trying to portray them as complete hypocrites because of primarily their conservative stance on marriage, while they in fact had been cheating on their spouse. Now, I will say this. I think that, yes, it is hypocritical for those people to cheat on their spouse. What they did with John Ensign, however, or not with John Ensign, with Mark Sanford, who I think is an awful politician, but they tried to make this case that Mark Sanford had declined stimulus money and that it was part of this ridiculous gospel that, the poor are poor because they deserve to be poor, and the Lord never, if they were valuable, if they had, I guess, the real value and faith in God, they wouldn't be so poor. That is not really why Sanford rejected the stimulus money. Now, I don't think that Mark Sanford was a particularly good governor, and then he wasn't a great congressman either. But when I did the math, I figured out that $700 million spread out across the residents of South Carolina that were below the poverty line at the time was a little less than $1,000. Not $1,000 a month, $1,000 period. So Mark Sanford would have essentially accepted $700 million that would have been spent for various services to poor South Carolinians at the time that would have been a very small drop in the bucket towards alleviating poverty in South Carolina. And we're not talking about just giving them a check. It would have just been services of various, I guess maybe job services or something, but 900 or something dollars of stimulus money is very little per person in terms of actually doing a tangible difference. And I'm someone who believes that the stimulus money never should have been spent anyway. And the fact is that the Obama stimulus packages were a tremendous failure during the administration. Both the auto bailout and the cash for clunkers and all of them were colossal failures. They didn't help to jumpstart the economy. And in fact, it's partially because of the stimulus packages that President Obama ended up having to extend the Bush tax cuts and basically retreat from a lot of his progressive promises at the time because they weren't going to work. The stimulus had already failed and the economy was not speeding up as fast as he needed to be. And then his poll numbers started to suffer as he was going into his re-election campaign. Another episode that they dealt with, just the gay marriage aspect, was, I think, a little troubling. And I'll admit, some of the stuff that was in there, I would say, was, I guess, very fair criticism of the family. Now, the family, I should have gotten to this at the beginning, was this organization that was led by Doug Coe, who's recently deceased, who was an evangelical minister trying to use political power in order to advance the goals of Christians worldwide. And there are other groups like that around the world that do the same thing. Some of them are on the left too. I don't see necessarily big documentaries being made out of that. I think one of the attractions of this series is that most people don't know that it's the family/fellowship that was behind the National Prayer Breakfast for all of these years. And I guess, it's interesting. I just don't see why it's this huge nefarious plot. As for episode 3, which I think is the one I'm talking about, New World Order, this one does concern problems with the family having relations with organizations in Uganda and other countries in Africa that did actually persecute and harm gay people. Okay, and I'll say this, I may not be this big standard bearer for gay rights at all, but I think that it is a problem when you hunt people down and burn them for allegedly engaging in some sort of homosexual act. I think that that's a very, very low standard of decency just to be able to oppose that. And I don't think the family came through on that. And therefore, I think that's an absolutely fair criticism by Jeff Sharlet, the person who wrote The Family, which is the book that this is based on over here. I actually ordered a used copy of it. So that was okay. And I think that certainly the moral ambiguity that they showed when they did let that happen or didn't criticize it harshly enough, that does show that there is some sort of problem with these organizations, that they're less committed to, I guess, asserting that their Christian theology should be implemented in the most peaceful and non-threatening way, right? So I think that is a problem. However, another problem in that episode that I think showed the shallow and ridiculously, I guess, myopic viewpoint of Jeff Sharlet and the left was their relationship, the way that they related to what happened in Romania. In Romania, some of these members of the family went and promoted this referendum in 2018 that was in order to enshrine in the Constitution of Romania the institution of marriage is between one man and one woman. Now, the victory for the gay community over there was that it did not pass the threshold of 30% turnout for the referendum. However, of the people that did turn out, which was looks like about 3.7 million people, 93% voted for yes, that they do believe that marriage is between a man and a woman. Meaning that, okay, this is important. While this issue is not important for the average Romanian, for the Romanians that did have an opinion on the issue, it was a massive, massive victory for people who are against gay marriage. And that, I think, is important. Okay, so it didn't pass the constitutional threshold, but you do see that if people do have an opinion on this, they don't support gay marriage. And I wouldn't support gay marriage either. I think gay marriage is kind of ridiculous. If you think about it as a social institution, there really is no point. If people have a gay relationship and they want the same benefits as married couples, there have been, there was the civil union thing that they talked about in the past. There should be ways, I guess, to protect people with the benefits. And I actually read a little bit of a story about this lady who was working for IBM. I forgot her name. And she'd had to struggle with that for several years because she'd been married to a dude and then she divorced him. And then she had a relationship with a woman for decades. And then the woman contracted, I guess it was multiple sclerosis and started to waste away. So yeah, I think that certainly you should be able to guarantee benefits for a significant other. But I don't think that that's called marriage. I think that's a different type of relationship. And if people want to call it something else, I really couldn't care less. Now, if people want to change the way society works and start to redefine the way that humans have been living since forever, because love is love, then I think we have a problem. Love is not love. I think people love their pets. I think there's a such thing as people loving their pets too much. I think people love their car. I think love is not love. It's the dumbest thing ever. And this documentary really started to make it seem like Romania had become this hellhole for gay people during the referendum run-up. And they were talking about, they were getting threats and blah, blah, blah. Look, I think that it's wrong to threaten people. I didn't see any evidence of any threats. I didn't see that there was any evidence that people had been actually assaulted because of it. Maybe I'm wrong. There were other referendums around, earlier than that in 2013 in Croatia, passed by also a very wide margin, not quite as wide, but 66%. And I think that over there wasn't the requirement of a threshold. And you also had, so these are kind of the Balkan countries and Eastern Europe. And then those countries are less liberal than the rest of the world. This was held in 2012. The Family Code Bill, this is in Slovenia, passed by the government of Borut Pahor, which expanded existing same-sex registered partnerships to have all rights of married couples except adoption, excluding stepchild adoption. So it was rejected. So in Slovenia, they actually tried to introduce the same-sex marriage benefits, and it was completely rejected. And look, I mean, if you want, it was a very close margin, but it's still lost. And Slovenia, I would say, is much more of a Western country than most of the Balkans. I used to work with a couple people from Slovenia. And then Slovakia, which is another country in that area, also voted very similar to not Hungary, but Romania. 94% for a gay marriage ban, 92% against gay adoption of children, 90% against sex education choice. Now you can criticize the choice, you can criticize the belief system, you can criticize the people of Romania and Slovakia and Slovenia, okay? But this is a democratic decision. The turnout in Slovakia, I believe, was 21%, and it did not reach the 50% threshold. So these countries built in the elements in their constitution to ensure that even if the measure passed, but the turnout was so low that public interest exhibited this or I guess illustrates that people are not sufficiently interested in it, that the gay community would technically be protected from it. So essentially what the family is making is much ado about nothing. People voted in these referenda. Two of these referenda were in the end non-binding because of the low turnout, and therefore no harm done. But we know what most people who care about these issues think. Most people in Slovakia, Slovenia, and Romania do not believe in gay marriage. In Slovakia, they also don't believe in gay adoption. They also don't believe in sex education choice, meaning that you should have your child be exposed to sex education related to gay, lesbian, and transsexual stuff. So I think that when Jeff Sharlet tries to paint the family as being these bigots who are out to get the gay people, no. If they would not have been activists in this, I think that the vote would have gone ahead and it would probably have won by 82%, which would have, what difference does it make? People in those countries do not believe in this modernist, anti-family agenda, and I don't believe in it either, frankly, and I'm not the most socially conservative person. I do think, though, that you do have to recognize that societies do live by certain standards. Now, the other two episodes are in and of themselves kind of interesting, but really dictators, murderers, and thieves. And I think New World Order. I think I might be confusing the two of them. Both of them attempt to paint the family as these people who they go around the world, they coddle dictators, and they party with people like Gaddafi. But the truth is that in Gaddafi's case, they do mention this. They got Gaddafi's Libya to extradite two people who were suspected of bombing Pan Am 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland in 1980. I think it was 86. That was an accomplishment. Okay, you don't have to like that they went there and they basically tried to preach the gospel to Gaddafi and his minions. But they did it. You didn't. There are a lot of people who are not exactly the most sympathetic figures. Jesse Jackson comes to mind. Jesse Jackson played the same role under Bill Clinton. He was this scumbag. He did corrupt dealings in Nigeria at the time. They accused the family of doing the same thing. But Jesse Jackson also has had hostages released, I believe, from Yugoslavia and maybe from China, and I think also from North Korea. So you don't have to like Jesse Jackson, but he did do those things. And you can't criticize him for that. I think sometimes diplomacy comes at a price, and one of the prices is that you sometimes have to send people who aren't the best examples of who we have to meet other people who are possibly horrible people, right? The last episode is basically a hit piece on Donald Trump. It kind of continues along the line that they're putting their Christian faith in the hands of this heathen, Donald Trump, this awful, craven, greedy casino billionaire. They showed several clips of him answering some questions about, well, do you ever ask forgiveness from Christ and whatever, blah, blah, blah. And he answered honestly, he doesn't. What do you want him to do, lie? So if he would have lied, you would probably have held him accountable for lying, I guess, or would you? What's the answer there? I really don't know. There was also a very, very salacious and sensational hit on Maria Butina and the NRA, she was, first of all, so Maria Butina, for those of you that don't know. So I guess I'll show you maybe a profile of her. So, no, not this one, BBC. So she was a Russian gun activist, and she'd also been circulating in evangelical quarters in Russia and in the United States. And she came to the U.S. and she went to NRA conventions, and I think she banged some dude who was active in the NRA. And after the 2016 election, she got accused of spying for the Kremlin, which is not true. She did not spy on the Kremlin. It says she has pleaded guilty to being directed by a Russian government official to establish unofficial lines of communication with Americans having power and influence over American politics. This is not the same thing as spying. Spying would have been something like trying to get secret information out of those individuals. Maybe she did spy, but there's no proof of it. Okay, this is the same thing the same tactic that I take with Aziz Ansari, the same tactic I take with Tavis Smiley, the same tactic I take with the Trumps, the same tactic I took with Roy Moore, the same tactic I took with the dancing Israelis, that the presumption of innocence applies, and until you have hard evidence that somebody did some wrongdoing, they are innocent. Doesn't matter if they're the worst person in the world. And I have no reason to believe that Maria Butina is the worst person in the world. So they paint her as this Russian spy in this documentary, or they try to insinuate that. They don't really go out and explicitly say it, but they do the whole job of making it seem like something corrupt and seedy is going on. And then they also throw in this notion that because the family back in the 50s, like almost every Christian group, was very anti-Soviet and critical of communism, that they somehow flip-flopped and were hypocritical because they started embracing the mission in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. This is so intellectually shallow that I don't know how they're even touching any real idea at this point. The people who opposed the Soviet Union during the Cold War were largely doing it because of the philosophy of the Soviet Union, not necessarily because of the fact that they were Russian. Some people probably did hate them because they were Russian. But at its core, the conflict of the Cold War was about economic systems. It was about political systems, democracy versus the Soviet system, which was central planning. Central planning of the economy and also central control of the political system. That's what I'm trying to say. So philosophically, people, including Christians, had a deep problem with that during the Cold War because in Russia, the Christian church was essentially subordinated entirely to the Soviet government in Moscow. So, of course, the other Christian sects around the world who were not under Soviet domination wouldn't want that type of control. They want creative control. Everybody wants creative control. We see it in music all the time. Bands break up over creative control, right? This doesn't have to be a religion versus state issue. This just has to be a control versus management proposition. So on the whole, I'd say this was a pretty deceptive documentary. It was very well made, I'd say, and the interviews are very interesting. So if you don't have Netflix, I don't know if you can find it on DVD, but that's about it. Please like, share, and subscribe. Also subscribe to me on BitChute and on Minds, as well as on Subscribestar if you want to donate. Those are all at Chef Leopard as my tag, and on Gab at Starscream85. And I'll talk to you later.
Inside my future eye, what I see just makes me